10 Royal Psalm collection, so it is our fourth entrance into this collection. And I want to remember that Psalm 21 pairs very well with Psalm 20. Psalm 20 was a pre-battle religious ceremony invoking the power of Yahweh to support the king in this military endeavor. So it was a pre-battle religious ceremony that assumed that all Israel would join in. It may have been recited by a priest, but in essence it was the solidarity of the entire nation. And Psalm 21 is going to show us a united post-battle religious celebration, this time of victory. Bookends, if you please, with Psalm 20. But before we begin looking at Psalm 21, let me go back and take a quick review of the three royal psalms we've looked at so far, just by way of remembrance. Psalm 2 was a four-step chiastic structure related to the anointing of a new earthly king in Israel and the unsettled status within the kingdom and the unrest, aggression of neighboring nations. This would happen because anytime you lose one king to death and you have to invoke or anoint or assert a new king, there can be unrest within the nation itself, and there can be a lot of unrest to the nations around, because the nations around think this may be a good time to take on Israel militarily. But in this psalm, Yahweh declares as King of Israel, in fact, he declares his anointed earthly king is his anointed choice and his adopted son. And so the king, then the earthly king, the Davidic king, asserts the God-given nature of his authority to rule, and then Yahweh himself tells the other nations to take notice that he rules the entire world. And he's going to set his king up on his holy hill in Jerusalem, and don't mess with him. Psalm 18, the second royal psalm, a little bit more complex. It was a 9-step chiasm that explored the king's gratitude and faith in Israel's God. The psalm included a hymn of praise and devotion. For what? Well, in gratitude for God's strength and power that was exercised on the king's behalf during a military endeavor. In gratitude for Yahweh's presence and intervention to deliver victories. It included a gleeful vengeance song, a unifying doxology, and a description of what God expects and how God rewards those who are obedient. And then in Psalm 20, it was a pre-battle prayer of intercession for the earthly king, the Davidic king, and for victory by a congregation gathered at the temple, probably again recited by a priest. And what was it for? It was to bring forth the king's need of God's presence in intervening for him, interceding for the king, saying, the king needs your presence, Lord, your protection, and your deliverance of victory. And they would have included an expression of confidence in the God of Israel, saying, we're asking you to do this. We know you will preserve our king, protect him, and bring him victory. And then we're going to claim right now that we believe that victory is going to happen. So now let's get on with the 13-verse Psalm of King David in Psalm 21. I'm going to do it first of all by giving you a PowerPoint presentation, because this is a chiastic structure with 5 steps. So I'm going to ask you to stay put, listen to this PowerPoint presentation. Thank you. We're looking at the chiastic structure of Psalm 21, 5 steps, step C being the central message. If we look at steps A and A prime, the first and last step, we notice they're very similar. The king's joy, or the people's joy, the Lord's strength in both cases. Verse 1 is step 1, step A, and the step A prime, the last step, the 5th step, is verse 13. Step B, the second step inward to the main message, is Yahweh's gifts to the king in verses 2 through 6, and we're going to deal with those verses separately, because those 4 verses in there, it looks like 5, but in verses 3 through 6, those 4 verses are their own chiastic structure. So we're going to look at a chiasm within a chiasm. And step B prime, the next to last step, is the people's expectations. Part B, Yahweh's gift to the king. Part B prime, step B prime, the people's expectation of the king, in verses 8 through 12. And the main message is found in the king's response, verse 7. And the king will respond to the victory that Yahweh has provided him. So let's take a look at some of these things in a bit more detail. Well, Yahweh is gracious in giving the king the victory that was requested. And the congregation now is to start things off. In verse 1, you saw the structure a minute ago, but Psalm 21:1, O Lord, in thy strength the king will be glad, and in thy salvation how greatly he will rejoice. The congregation celebrates the king's victory over his enemies, which are Israel's enemies, which are in turn God's enemies. Those 3 sets of enemies, the kings, the nations, and God's, are assumed to be the same set of enemies. And the thanks is because of God's intervention in strength, a rejoicing because of deliverance to victory, and this will be a rejoicing in which the king will participate, surely. The assumption is that the king is on the same page as Yahweh in defense of himself, his nation, and his God. But before moving on, we want to look particularly that you have parallelism. And again, we're probably going to overdo this parallelism thing, but we want you to see it, get used to seeing it anytime you read the Psalms. Verse 1 is a single verse, but it has 2 lines. There is poetic parallelism again in those 2 lines. The first line is saying that the king and actually the whole congregation is glad in the strength of Yahweh. The second line says fundamentally the same thing. They rejoice in the deliverance of Yahweh. Now, when you get into step B, you're going to see a chiasm within the larger chiasm. Verse 2 will introduce the chiasm, which is actually found in verses 3 through 6, and they're giving you the reasons for the celebration. Psalm 21 verse 2. Thou hast given him, that's the king, his heart's desire, and thou hast not withheld the request of his lips. Notice again the parallelism, a barrage of parallelism, if you care. First line, you have given the king's heart's desires. You have not withheld the king's request. That sound familiar? Go back to Psalm 20, the pre-battle psalm, intercessory prayer given before the battle. And it said this in Psalm 20, verse 4. May he, this is the intercession, may he grant you, the king, your heart's desire. May he, Yahweh, grant you your heart's desire, king, and fulfill all your counsel. So what was that pre-battle prayer about? Grant the king, we're asking Yahweh to grant the king his heart's desire and fulfill his plans and strategy militarily. That prayer was evidently answered, as we just saw in verse 2, by a victorious outcome, and the thanksgiving is due Yahweh. And again, let's go to another PowerPoint demonstration that will show us verses 3 through 6, a 7-step, 1, 2, 3, 4 to the center, 3 back out, a 7-step chiastic structure. We'll take a look at that next. The goal is to show the chiastic structure of verses 3 through 6 of our Psalm 21. So let me go there and see if we can get there. Notice it fills the screen fairly well. I'm looking at verses 3, 4, 5, and 6, and I'm going to spell it out. You notice that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 steps to the center, 3 more steps back out, so that's a 7-step chiastic structure. And so let's read those 4 verses. For thou dost meet him, the king, of course, and this is after, remember, the victory that has just been secured with the help of Yahweh. Step B, with the blessings of good things. And step C, thou dost set a crown of fine gold on his head. And we'll look at each of these things after we look at this particular structure. And so all 3 of those steps were from verse 3. So it's 3a, 3b, and 3c. And then step D is found in verse 4. He, the king, asked life of thee, thou didst give it to him, length of days forever and ever. And while that's not exactly clear necessarily, it is a statement about the Davidic covenant. And then stepping back out again, step C prime, from verse 5, his glory is great through thy salvation, splendor and majesty thou dost place upon him. And again, if you're paying attention, you're seeing some parallelism in here. Verse 6a gives us step B prime, for thou dost make him most blessed forever. And final step A prime, which is verse 6b, thou dost make him joyful with gladness in thy presence. And if we wish, we could look at it this way and restate things a little more briefly, independent of the verses. Step A describes Yahweh's presence, that's in verse 3a. Step B, the king's blessing, in verse 3b, and step C, the king's glory, in verse 3c. And the center point is that the life of David's dynasty goes on forever. That's in verse 4. Backing out a bit now in C prime, we go back and look at the king's glory, which was from verse 5. Then we back out one more step to B prime, the king's blessing, which is found in verse 6a, and Yahweh's presence found in verse 6. Well, God met the king. What was God's presence worth to the king? Or what is God's presence worth to you? Check what it meant to Abraham and to David. I'm going to go back and look at Genesis 12, verses 7 and 8. And it says this, "And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your descendants I will give this land.' So he built," that's Abraham, built, or Abram at that time, I guess, built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him, a visible theophany. Then Abram proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. Remember, these were spots recognized from the conquest of Israel. Bethel, by the way, means house of El, house of God. And there Abram built an altar to the Lord, a second altar, and he called upon the name of Yahweh. And now in chapter 14, verses 18 through 20, this is where Abraham has just rescued Lot. He's on his way back from his victorious battle with the kings around Sodom and Gomorrah. And it says this, starting in verse 18 of chapter 14, "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He intervened and made himself present before Abram. Now he was a priest of God Most High." Interesting, we know nothing about Melchizedek prior to this. We will see nothing of him in the Old Testament after this. This is his sole appearance. We do not have any genealogy for him, nor do we have any death or birth of him. He just suddenly appears. Verse 19, "And he blessed Abram and said, 'Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth,'" that's God, of course, "'and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies,'" Abram's enemies, "'into your hand.' And he, Abram, gave him, Melchizedek, a tenth of all." So the priest of God came out, did this intercession for Abram, in front of Abram. Abram responded by giving a tithe to Melchizedek in honor of God's work on his behalf and his appreciation of it. Look at a different situation in 2 Samuel 7:9. This is God talking to David, where God gives him the Davidic covenant. And it says, "And I have been with you," this is Yahweh speaking, "and I, Yahweh, have been with you wherever you, David, have gone. And I have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make you a great name, like the names of the great men who are on the earth." So David was very much appreciative of what God had done. And God said, "I'm going to do this for you." But in verse 3, there are two other matters that we're going to look at. God's presence means blessings. God gives honor to those he ordains who in truth or in turn obey. That is a golden crown. The verse life in verse 4 that was given in that chiastic structure is likely life in and through the reign of the Davidic covenant, relating to the promise of David's eternal dynasty, his eternal throne, and therefore his eternal reign through, eventually, the Messiah, Jesus our Christ. Verse 5 back here in Psalm 21 continues the parallelism. The first line says, glory and honor because of the victory went to the king, although it was God who delivered that. And to the king also goes, that's line 2, renown bestowed on the king because of his military victory. So God says, I performed these, you appreciate it, but I will give you honor, I will give you renown. And then in verse 6, the king finds joy and gladness from the presence of Yahweh. Pleasance, yes, but presence. And he makes the statement he's going to be blessed eternally, the king will be. He will be made glad by the king's presence. So, let's get on with the rest of Psalm 21 and the main step in the chiasm, which is verse 7, the king's response. And it says in verse 7 of Psalm 21, for the king trusts in the Lord, and through the loving kindness of the Most High, of loving kindness of Yahweh, the king will not be shaken. Experientially, the king, the Davidic king, knew he could trust God. As a consequence of his trust and God's loving kindness, the king and his reign will not be shaken by circumstances or enemies. The because that supports verse 7 follows. So let's look at step B prime, the people's expectation of the king in verse 8. And it goes through verse 12. Your hand will find out all your enemies. Your right hand will find out those who hate you. This is saying that the king will be able to root out all of his enemies, and his right hand will be the reason that takes place. Now, obviously, that's a reference also to Yahweh's arm, his right arm, because Yahweh's arm will root out the enemies for the king and will give power to the king for dealing with those enemies. Verse 9, you will make them as a fiery oven in the time of your anger. But this is the God we're speaking about now. And because it continues, the Lord will swallow them up in his wrath, and fire will devour them. Notice two more lines. You'll make them as a fiery oven in the time of your anger. You will swallow them up in your wrath, Yahweh. And it goes on again. These are all two-liners. Verse 10, their offspring thou wilt destroy from the earth. Physically, it's going to be the king doing this, but realistically, it is Yahweh making it happen. And the second line, and their descendants from among the sons of men. So again, you have your offspring, you're going to destroy them. Their descendants, same thing, right? You're going to destroy them from among the men on this earth. And look at verse 11, continues that pattern. Though they intended evil against you, and they devised a plot, there's the parallelism. They're not going to succeed. It doesn't double it. It just says they intend evil against you, they devise a plot, waste of time. It ain't going to happen. Those plans will not succeed against the king, again, because of Yahweh's intervention. For thou, O king, and it doesn't say O king, that's my ad. We're back to looking at the king. You'll make them turn their back. You'll make them get up and run. They'll retreat in the face of battle with you because God is with you. And in the second line, thou wilt aim thy bowstrings at their faces. I find that kind of interesting because they've turned their backs and are running, but where are the bowstrings aimed? At their faces, which means somehow you have to get in front of them to do that. Keep in mind, by the way, that if there is a loss in war, if there's a loss in a battle, that loss threatens the very existence of the nation. Every wartime effort was a time of severe distress. That's why there's so much appreciation for Yahweh's intervention. Verse 8, God through his king is going to rid Israel of her enemies. And it's then restated again in terms of the king's right hand against those who hate Israel. And again, verse 9, Israel acknowledges it's actually God who gives the victory to the king as the one executing God's wrath. The king is the one executing God's wrath in terms of these enemies. Again in verse 10, what's the extent of God's work through the king? A complete ridding of the enemies, including their offspring and their offspring's offspring. It's as if he said, you're going to wipe the enemies off the face of the map, never to have to look at them again. And in verse 11, the enemies plot evil, but their plans will fail. Verse 12, interestingly, because of Yahweh, the enemy will turn and run, but their demise will be met head on, not shot in the back. So Israel said, take this, you guys. So finally then, the Davidic king and the congregation both recognize who Israel's true king is. The Davidic king is the earthly king, but the true king is Yahweh, of course. Notice verse 13, which closes out Psalm 21. Be thou exalted, O Yahweh, in thy strength. We will sing and praise thy power. All Israel acknowledges that the needed strength and might to overcome enemies comes from Yahweh. They will praise and worship to exalt Yahweh, and those praises and worships are in order and are given. What's next up for